One way to help us get a sense of the state of well being in the United States is to compare it to human welfare in other countries. And one of the things that we find when we do that is we discover that the United States is very clearly an outlier, and that's not in a good way. Americans fare worse across a broad range of measures than do people in other rich democracies. So let's start by looking at some of that international context, and this is looking at overall poverty rates. And I know that this is a little bit hard to see, but that's poverty rates of countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, 32 essentially rich democracies. And every country to the left of that red arrow has a lower rate of poverty than does the United States. This is now looking at child poverty or the rate of poverty among those under the age of 18. It's not quite as bad here, as you can see, as it is for overall poverty, but every country to the left of that red arrow has lower rates, has fewer children living in poverty than there are in the United States. This is infant mortality, or how many children are born but die before they reach their first birthday. So as you can see here, it's not quite as bad as it is for poverty and for child poverty. But once again, look to the left of that blue arrow there. They all have lower rates of infant mortality than we do. In every one of those places, children have a better chance of surviving into adulthood than they do in the US. This is now looking at the other end of the spectrum. So this is life expectancy. How long can you expect to live, right? You can see here that almost everywhere people are living longer than they did in 1970. So that's a very, very good thing indeed, and we'll pay some attention to that down the road. But we in the United States, nonetheless, still have lower expectancy than do every one of those countries to the left of the blue arrow. You can see here that things in the US have actually been getting worse over the past couple of decades in this regard. So this is looking at what the difference is between our life expectancy and the average of all of those OECD countries, right? You can see that sort of in that post-war period, we fared a bit better, right? We had slightly higher average life expectancy, but we are now looking at declining life expectancy in comparison to those other rich democracies. Now, one thing that's important to notice is that that's looking overall at the population, right? But there's a lot of variation within population groups. And what we know is that in the United States, people with higher incomes have actually seen their life expectancy rise just as they have been in other countries. But those in the bottom 40% of the population, of the income distribution, have actually experienced declines. And one thing that's important to note is that we see more of that kind of variation between and across population groups here in the United States than we do in lots of those other countries. So overall, Americans are poorer, they're less likely to survive childhood, and more likely to die young than are residents of other countries. And yet, here's a curious thing. For all of these unfavorable outcomes, we spend more per person on healthcare, that's before the Affordable Care Act and after the Affordable Care Act, we spend more per person on healthcare than anybody else does. Now, among other things, there's a really good hint there that when we are trying to evaluate policies and programs, we're going to have to look at more than just how much money they spend, since as healthcare tells us, there's not necessarily going to be a correlation between how much money you spent and the kinds of results that you've achieved. Now, here's the dimension that I think people tend to find most surprising. So we not only have higher rates of poverty and child poverty and infant mortality and lower rates of life expectancy, but we have lower rates of upward mobility too. Now, this cuts against the core narrative of what the US is meant to be, right? It's supposed to be the land of opportunity, where if you work hard and play by the rules, anyone can grow up to be anything they want to be, right? But it's not true. There's more upward economic mobility in every one of these countries. In Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Norway, Australia, Canada, Finland, the UK, France, and Italy all have higher rates of economic mobility than we do. To Put that a little bit differently, if you are born poor in the United States, you are more likely to die poor than if you were born poor in any number of nations in Western Europe or in the Nordic countries. It's getting worse lately across this dimension too, not better, as this chart shows. This is now looking at that decline in mobility across a couple of selected states. And I should have pointed this out earlier, but right, you can pause this at any time and sort of look at any of these slides. If there's anything here you want to burrow in and try to look at in more detail. This is looking at an overall picture of how mobility varies from state to state. And I think this is really important because, again, I noted earlier that when you look at those overall averages, that obscures a lot of variation between groups, and one of those groups is economic groups. The other place, one of the many other places in which we find variation, is by geography. So if you look at those dark red spots on the map there, those are the places with the very lowest mobility. And if you look at sort of the places with the almost white, very pale yellow color, those are the places with the highest mobility. So again, where you are born, where you live, may in fact tell us a lot about the opportunities available to you. But why, right? Why do Americans fare so much worse across so many different dimensions, and why is there so much variation from group to group? Now, at some level, I think the answer to that is not actually all that complicated. We have more poverty, for example, because we do less as a matter of policy to reduce it. So let me show you what I mean here. So take a look at this chart and start by looking at those blue bars. And that's showing you what is sometimes referred to as pre-transfer poverty or market poverty, or sometimes what's called natural poverty. That's simply a measure of how much poverty there is in a country before we take into account the effects of things that government does to reduce it. So you can think of this as how much poverty the economy creates on its own. And as you can see, we're actually not an outlier in this regard. The United States' rate of pre-transfer poverty is lower than it is in France or Germany or Australia. It's even lower in Sweden. Our economy creates less poverty than does the Swedish economy. But now look at the red bar. And that's post-transfer poverty, or real poverty. That is, how much poverty is there once we factor in all of the things that government does or doesn't do to reduce it. And that's when we become the outlier. Exactly the same kind of pattern for child poverty. So why do we have more poverty and why do we have more child poverty than other rich democracies? Because even though our economy doesn't necessarily create more of it, our government does less to reduce it. So here's one way to look at that, and this is total government expenditures, social expenditures, as a percentage of the total economy. So as a share of our total expenditures, we do less. We always have. That's us, that black line on the bottom looking at just cash public assistance programs since 1800. So this is a long-standing pattern that we have had a weaker, a smaller, a more restricted welfare state than have these other countries. And now this is a more recent pattern looking at, just since the 1960s, looking at not just cash assistance programs, but a range of programs that target their benefits to poor and low-income people. You can see that spike in the post-war on poverty period, but a pretty steady decline afterward of the efforts that the public sector is making to improve well-being. But at some way, this just sort of underlines the question for us, right? Why do we do less? And as we're going to see, it's not just that we do less. What we do, we do differently. We depend much more upon the private sector, for example, and upon means-tested categorical programs. That is, programs you've got to demonstrate the need to qualify for. We depend more on that kind of thing rather than the kind of universal programs that everybody's eligible for in, say, the Netherlands. Those are programs that distribute their benefits broadly to everyone to prevent poverty from happening in the first place. We don't have too many of those. Instead, the United States tends to allow poverty to happen and then tries to reduce it after the fact. Again, I think that's part of the puzzle, right? Why? Why are we so different? Why do we do less and why do we do it so differently? And why have things gotten worse in recent decades? Those are some of the questions that we're going to try to make sense of this semester.